Save the Stub.
Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the Save the Stub podcast. I am Rory and I'm joined as ever by the notorious HLO, our film reviewer expert, Harry Osborne. How are you doing, Harry?
Yeah, I'm good. Thanks, mate. Happy birthday.
Oh,
Got that in, didn't I?
thank you. And of course, our film, I won't say novice, I'll say our film student, Will Foster. How are you, Will?
Thanks, Rory. Well, I've got to say, you're a lot kinder than Harry has been in the last 2 episodes, so appreciate it.
Leave it out.
We've got to share the love. But today we are looking at a perennial cinema epic, The Matrix, the success and or failures of Martin Scorsese, however you'd like to pronounce that director's name, and a terrifying new rendition of the Rugrats that we've all got to look forward to. So should we get into the episode, guys?
Let's go.
Yeah, go on then.
Film of the week.
So in this week's Film of the Week, we are looking at The Matrix. Obviously, a very big film that means a lot to cinema lovers all around the world. But let's start with you, Will. As a kind of cinema novice, what did this film mean to you?
Yeah, I feel like I need to start by apologising to all the film lovers because I've never seen The Matrix until this point. But it's like in the top 20 films of all time on quite a few rankings, isn't it? So I feel like it's one that was overdue. Do you know what? So I've said before that you need to rewatch certain films multiple times to fully appreciate what they're about and kind of understand what the real message was and stuff. And like, I already know that The Matrix is definitely one of those films. So my opinion isn't going to be the most informed, I will admit. But I did enjoy the film. I think it's quite easy to see why it's a bit of a cult film and why it was so successful. I've got to admit, like my initial impressions were that it was actually quite a cheesy, like stereotypical action film, I guess.
Oh, mate, you cannot be saying that.
There were bits that were a little bit like cringy to me. I have to admit, I have to be honest, that's just initially what I thought. I thought some of the lines and stuff was a bit overacted, but I did enjoy it, and I've had to do a bit more research after watching the film just to see if I've got a rounded picture of what the film was about. And it's so much more than what you see in the first time round. So I'll definitely be watching it again, and maybe that plays into kind of my score and things that I'll give later on. But I would say initially I enjoyed it. I'm not particularly good, and I acknowledge that I'm not particularly good at always understanding the deeper meaning of certain films, particularly, things like Tenet or Inception or whatever. I do have to watch them a few times. So yeah, but I would say it was good, and I'm looking forward to watching it again.
Yeah, I think one thing to consider with The Matrix is that this film was made in 1999. Like, it very much kind of set the standard for action films, or at least modern action films, that kind of blend of action and something with a bit more deeper meaning. But Harry, for you, what does The Matrix kind of, does it hit it? Does it hit the spot when it comes to action films, or does it kind of, is it you a bit more like Will in the sense that you kind of get lost a little bit?
I mean, like, the thing is, The Matrix set the precedent. Like, even if you think it's cheesy, and don't get me wrong, Will, I totally agree with you. Some of it is really cringe. It's essentially nerd porn, isn't it? The Matrix. Yeah. It's just bloke walking around in trench coats, firing as many rounds of like semi-auto machine guns as they can, and then they'll do some like sci-fi magic. But the thing is, it is the thing that established that being the norm for cinema. Because the thing that's interesting about The Matrix really is that you can think it's as cheesy as you like, and you might even not fully understand what you watch. But when you look at the sort of the deeper meanings of quite a lot of what the Wachowskis did, the directors, I mean, beneath what you probably saw on screen, it's actually amazing how sort of intricate, not only the plot, but the concepts behind it and the things they use in terms of like filming techniques or the subtle little things that you wouldn't notice, but that subconsciously you might pick up, is what actually makes The Matrix the film that it's sort of recognized as today. And, even for all of its faults, it can be one of those films that you hate, almost like, how The Room is that awful film that's sort of got this cult status. But because of what it's established, and, The Matrix is like it's a phrase in and of itself, isn't it? Things like red pilling and The Matrix and all this stuff have its own distinct ground of what it is as film. I think that's what makes it a great film, rather than it necessarily being something you could watch time and time again and just love and be like, yeah, great. That's The Matrix. That's one of my favorite films. It's what it's established more than what it still stands for, I'd say.
I think one place where it gets a lot of criticism is kind of it balances action and deeper meaning, but a lot of the time that meaning seems to be lost in the action, or people say that. Will, when you were watching it for the first time, did you feel like you could appreciate both the action sequences and what they kind of represented on a deeper level than just the plot?
Yeah, so for me, it was a bit overwhelming with the action, and that kind of distracted from trying to unpick some of the messages that, having watched a few more clips, like I said, after the film, but not the whole thing, they were fairly obvious, but just the first time round, it was a bit like a sense overload of all of the stuff that was going on. I mean, a lot of this film is very loud, and there's a lot of music in it, which is like really quite intense and loud. And obviously that plays with how you feel at the time and stuff. So I think as a first watch, that kind of stuff is a bit distracting. But yeah, Harry, I fully agree. Like I would actually say like The Matrix is very rewatchable just because the amount of stuff that's actually in it. And I did come out of the film thinking, is this the first film of this kind of style where there's so many hidden messages, and it's an action film, but there's a lot of hidden messages. And not knowing a lot about films, I didn't know, but I did get that feeling that it was that kind of film.
It's a strange one as well, because as Rory said, made in 1999. So this is sort of the birth of visual effects and computer narrated images, CGI, really coming to sort of the forefront of mainstream films. Because this was done on quite a slim budget for what it actually is. I think it was $60 million. And if you think now, these Avengers films cost $1 billion each, whatever they cost. It's something silly money. Maybe actually that's a total lie. They cost like 500 million to make something stupid like that.
It's a lot.
This set a precedent again in terms of like what you can do without actually having actors and stunt doubles and real sets and all these sort of things. And that almost by itself is again what sets this film apart, by just taking so many sort of leaps in this direction, because the Wachowskis essentially made a decision to push a boundary with this film. If they'd made this, it had been unsuccessful, we probably wouldn't have ever heard of them again. And yet there's a Matrix 4 coming out in like 2 years, because this trilogy or whatever is now the seminal sort of example of, is this a real world, AI taking all of those sort of things on board as well. And just looking at like the effort that went into actually making this, the opening action scene was 6 months of training and 4 days of shooting for like a scene that's probably, I don't know, what is that, like 2 minutes long? Not even that. And the bits of choreography, and they wouldn't use stunt doubles and all this other stuff. It's sort of them showing that you can use CGI more widespread than just your TV ads, or and you could use it in films because it's now accessible enough and probably cheap enough as well at a point that it's a viable option instead of you having to literally toss people off buildings and start fires and blow up sets and things like that. But I mean, in terms of plot, do you really like the plot, Will? Do you think like that is actually a sick plot?
Yeah, again, this goes back to like this being the first film of its kind, I guess, if that is the case, like 1999. The plot is still very watchable today. I mean, even with things like Black Mirror that have come out, a lot later than this, and other films where they really require you to think and question like society as it is today. It like the plot is good. I can't lie. And genuinely, when I was watching it, I was very confused at the start of the film about what it was going to be about, which is obviously the idea. And I think it was revealed in a way where you learnt more and more about where the plot was going at the end, like the more you watch the film, which I do really appreciate. We talked about, Pixar films and Disney films that are obviously aimed at kids, but I guess a drawback of those kind of films is that you do kind of get an impression of where the film is going to end up, like really quite early on in the film. We're obviously talking about a different genre, a different type of film here, but I appreciated the plot. I thought the plot was really good, to be fair, and it was well thought out. But I think why this film stands out is the way that it was presented, just the way it was written, not necessarily like the lines or that is plot, I suppose, isn't it? Really, it's not.
Because the way it was innovative was that it was kind of the first time someone had effectively looked at technology and like this kind of existential question, like in a way that was applicable to everyone watching it. I think, well, applicable through the action or through if you kind of gave it that time. But like you look at films from ages back, like Metropolis, which kind of started to look at technology and like the kind of industrial side of it. But when you haven't got an audience that are all engaged and all invested in technology, it becomes harder to kind of get people thinking about those questions. Whereas once everyone's using a computer, everyone is working in an office where they're kind of staring at a screen, it becomes a lot easier to get that message across. And when you have the action sequences to kind of keep people excited about the film, like you said, that second watching, that third and fourth rewatching, you suddenly kind of, your eyes get opened, which I think definitely happened to me. Like even watching it for like the fourth or fifth time a couple of years ago, I was like, I'm seeing stuff that I've never seen before.
Yeah. And it's a little bit, I don't know, it's a little bit cringe to say, but you do sort of get, even if you only had it for half a second, you do have that split second of thinking genuinely, is this like a possibility that we were, living in a machine? And it sounds awful to say.
You're opening up, like, Harry.
you think about it because you sort of see the concept as not believable, but like it's something that's not entirely out of the realms of possibility. It's the same thing that has been debated before by psychologists and stuff that, I think, but therefore I am. It's just on the same level as AI in the current day. How can we readapt that storyline? But I mean, to me, the outstanding bit of the Matrix is still the VFX. You can wax lyrical about the story and the plot, which I know that the studio had to do a lot of work on after they were given the script to make sure that people understood it, rather than being sort of one of those films you just got to interpret to your own level and then Google the answers. But the stuff that they did to just make you think differently about the films, when you see action films now, for example, all the fights they're all quick cuts, really up close, and the camera's always moving. And the idea is it's supposed to make you feel like you're engaged in the fight. But often it's just an excuse they can use stunt doubles without you seeing their faces. And so they don't actually have to do big fights, but can make them look more exciting than they actually are. So the Matrix does the opposite, where a lot of your fights, they use a thing called the God's eye shot, where you're essentially standing quite far back from the action. And they fight in an open space, and they nearly sort of green screen in the entire environment and the background. And that was quite a deliberate decision. They said, we don't want to do these close-up fights. We want to do this God's eye shot, which is a thing you see quite a lot in quite a lot of Asian films. So, things like Hero and stuff like that, these big samurai films, they do a lot of God's eye stuff because it's far easier for you to see the effort that they've put into film, and people appreciate that, even if it's subconscious. And it makes you sort of think, oh, actually, even though there's a disconnect from what I'm seeing, that makes sense in the Matrix because you are disconnected. And that's, it's all these little themes that they've got running through the film the whole time. It's heightened reality. It's not supposed to be real because it isn't real. And they're giving you that through these shots. It's all well and good saying that at points you feel disconnected or whatever, but it was all intentional. And that's almost more impressive than you building these films with great choreographed up close fights that actually just, you can't really tell what's going on because it's just a blur of color. They did everything very, very deliberately in the Matrix.
Yeah, and one thing that I noticed when I was watching the film straight away, that shot where it's kind of like the freeze where a character might be in a pose, and then you get like a 180 pan around I'm pretty, that is a famous technique and a famous shot. I've got
to talk about that because it's so sick how they do
that comes from the Matrix, right? Isn't it? Like the Matrix is
it literally does, yeah.
They did that.
So there were two guys, I can't remember their names, who invented this thing, and it's called bullet time. And what they do is, so that shot of Neo falling backwards with the bullets flying over him, everything in that is CG apart from Neo. He's the only thing that's real in that. Obviously, they didn't fire bullets at him, and he's not on the rooftop somewhere. And the whole point is, they have, I think it's something like 360 cameras placed in a circle around him. Because it was easier for them to essentially just pull him backwards and put him on like a stand so he can lie back and do that, freeze frame slow-mo thing. And they can just spin and take a photo with each of the cameras as it goes round. But because even if you did that, obviously you've then got to fill in the gaps between each shot. So it has to look smooth. Otherwise you just have you'd have a series of photos going around him. So they then have computer technology that can fill in the gaps and essentially interpret what the space between each of these shots were. But then on top of that, when it spins around him, there are points where it sort of slows down and speeds up, aren't there? So there's a bit where, you're alongside him and it's dead slow, and then it speeds up to go around the front and then it slows down again. And they only do that by spacing out the cameras at different intervals, so you get this bullet time effect of it slowing up and speeding down. But like they essentially invented new filming technology and filming devices purely to film this one, like, what is that, 2 second scene?
I think they used that technique a couple of points in the film, to be fair, but considering that it's still like a highly regarded technique today in cinema and photography, the fact that this was like the very late 90s and they included it in an action film, I think seeing that kind of shot for the first time, particularly maybe in a cinema or whatever, that must have been really, really pretty special, to be honest. And there's lots of examples of other points in the film where they do different things that you, again, like me, I've not seen the film multiple times, so I've not picked them out, but I'm sure that they're there, and I can definitely appreciate that they're there.
To be honest, Will, you mentioned that you were maybe less impressed by the script, but I think there are certainly kind of looking through the action scenes, once you watch it a second or third time, maybe it kind of gives you that space to focus on some of the lines that are delivered, but they are delivered so well. When you look at the acting performances of people like Lawrence Fishburne and Hugo Weaving as Agent Smith, like the delivery of those lines, what they kind of mean when you start thinking about them, the way they make you feel about technology or about like the human race, I think like they are so impactful. And it creates such a nice balance where you have these snippets of like the existential question that comes with the film, but you can still enjoy the action scenes. I think that's kind of where it fell off towards the next two films that you will see. But I think the way that action kind of becomes leaned on a bit more. Essentially, we were talking about how it's innovative, right? It's like the first time we see an action film like this. But you watch the second film, or maybe the third film, and you'll think, wow, this has like the exact same format as like Avatar or like big action film. It doesn't feel different. It doesn't feel innovative. And I think that is kind of where it falls down. But looking at that first film that set the precedent, like you said, Harry, I think it will just like always be iconic in my understanding of cinema.
And that's what almost scares me about this fourth one that's coming out next year, or whenever it is, maybe a year after, is I don't see what they're actually trying to achieve. Because broadly speaking, the first Matrix is seen as one of the best films ever. The second and the third one are not put in the same category. You know, they're very much seen as money grabs that sort of give you some explanation of what the entire Matrix story is for the people who want closure, which, to be honest, was me. I Googled what happens in the next two because I didn't want to sit through them because I know they're not particularly good and they don't look great. I've seen a few clips of what's in them and they go so hard on things like the CGI that you're completely detached from it. You know, you're not really enjoying it anymore. So this fourth one, is this just another money grab again? I mean, it comes back to my thing about sequels and remakes. I just don't. They are there to make you money, not to be objectively good. And don't get me wrong, the Wachowskis could have written something really good, and Keanu Reeves signing onto it is pretty positive to me. But I'm still looking at it. I'm still thinking, does it need a fourth?
The way I see it is, I imagine they're kind of seeing it as an opportunity to do like a modern, not retake, but like a modern take on the ideas that they had. And I think in 1999, those ideas with technology were innovative because they had this huge audience that had developed with technology. But now that has reached such a kind of expanded level where like everyone's got a smartphone. It's not just people that compute all the time, but like everyone is even more connected than they were in 1999 to this Matrix, or like potential Matrix, I guess. But I think there's a lot of kind of movements and schools of thought that they wouldn't have been able to put into a film back then. And maybe looking at 2021, they think, okay, the audience will be a bit more receptive, especially when it comes to stuff like trans rights. I mean, I've obviously the directors, the Wachowski sisters, that's quite important to them. And I think there's so many things looking back at The Matrix where they kind of saw these comments or commentaries on being transgender and how that fit into like identity and how they could use technology to kind of mirror it. So I think kind of giving that message across a bit more in a modern film would be a lot more effective, or a lot more, I don't want to say safe because that kind of belittles it a little bit, but a lot more. It's more, it's almost accessible and accepted, because at the end of the day, there will be some people who, you know, as there is with everything, who still are anti, and yet will have seen the first Matrix, loved it, and not realize that one of the main supporting cast with Morpheus is that character Switch,
who literally changes gender depending on what universe she or he is in. Did you notice as well?
No, I had.
Characters will switch, white hair.
That didn't actually happen.
Okay. Right.
It was written into the script, but essentially you've got this really androgynous character who kind of in the original script, they were a man when they were in the Matrix and they were a woman when they were in the real world. Essentially seeing this kind of like, there's so many things when it comes to gender dysmorphia, like through the technology and through one quite interesting thing is Neo gets referred to as Mr. Anderson, like exclusively by Agent Smith. And you see Agent Smith as kind of like figure of transphobia. And he kind of exclusively calls him by his previous name and refuses to like acknowledge his new identity, which definitely like, I think that resonates quite a lot for a lot of like people in that community now. But yeah, the way the characters are kind of used to convey that message is so good.
I think the thing about the Matrix, and we've been talking about it for a while now, but not exclusively said it, is there's just so many parts to it which is why it's such a great film. I mean, just the thing that you've just explained, Rory, about subtle hints of transphobia and trans rights, that's an element of it. I mean, we've not addressed it yet, but there's a whole Christ narrative of this story that is just a whole nother part of the plot, that is not something that you necessarily see first time, but is there. There's also kind of like a 7-part philosophy that goes on. I'm going to Google that now to try and get a bit more detail on the exact nature of it. But you can split the film into 7 parts, and it's kind of like a well-known area of philosophy. It's sort of about breaking down initial barriers and then rebuilding and exploring and things like that. The character names, like Neo is an anagram for one, and there's an antagonist called Cypher. Cypher is another name for zero. So you kind of got like a binary 1 and 0 opposite. There's just so many subtle things on this film that you'd never know if you watched it one time or maybe even 3 or 4 times. But there are people out there on the internet. There's loads of good sources on the internet, obviously, because this film came out so long ago now, and it's got a cult following, where people can explain in really great detail kind of like the subtleties of the film. Should we talk about acting?
Like the lore.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, for sure. I was just going to say
go on, Rory.
I think the amount of lore in this film, that kind of expanded universe, is just huge. And I think the directors saw it as not a film, but something that would grow outside of that film. And I don't know whether what you guys think, you've kind of touched on it there, but whether all of these allusions, all of these kind of deeper meanings maybe pollute the film a little bit, make it a bit too saturated, or whether you think you can look at it from the outside as more than just a film and like start those conversations.
I think at some point you have to also accept that some fan theories are just quite nicely coincidental. It's as with all of these things, when you watch things like Star Wars or Lord of the Rings or any of these massive franchises, there will be things that just slot into place that weren't intentional but have happened. And that's not a slight at the directors saying that they've done something they didn't mean to and taking credit for it. It's just, sometimes these things do just end up linking up and they look quite nice.
That's classic.
I don't,
isn't it?
Yeah, isn't it? I don't think it pollutes the film so much as it's there if you want to look at it, but you don't have to, isn't it? Because, you could watch a film and objectively take no interest in it. Like, you could watch this Matrix film and for all you know, you didn't even understand what they're talking about when they said red pill and blue pill, but you still enjoyed the fight scenes or whatever. Or you could be the other side of the coin and say, I really enjoyed the philosophical nature of what they were talking about. Wow, I've actually noticed some trends there that I didn't think I had. And then you look online and realize there's 100 other people saying the exact same thing as you and more, and it's all these little, because I think something that sets out some sets of films is putting in details that if, say, you were to watch it in a group of 5 of you, if 2 of you noticed a detail that the other 3 didn't, that makes the film better in some respects, because it's almost like you've seen something that they put in intentionally for you, but isn't there to always be noticed, but that rewards you on 2nd, 3rd, 4th time viewing. It was the same thing as there was a horror series that came out last year called Haunting of Hill House, and they put a ghost in every single episode at some point when they're in this house, but you don't always notice it, even if you're sitting in a group. So if you do notice it, it's almost like, wow, you've got that reward of saying, hey, do you see this thing? And then you talk about it later, and it's almost like an earworm because you keep speaking about these little things. And it'd be stuff like, for example, when they're in the Matrix in this film, everything has a green filter on it. But when they're in the real world, everything has a blue filter on it, because they thought that green represented sort of computer and AI. And, when all the code comes down the screen, it's all in green and stuff, whereas blue was a more sort of world-like and human color. And it's little things like that. And some people will have had that subconscious influence of that, and some people won't. But in my mind, that makes it a better film, because there's so many more layers to it than your one-way linear films where the start, middle, and end. The antagonist and protagonist are, and everyone comes to the same conclusion by the end of who's right, who's wrong, and how the plot went. So, I wouldn't say that it pollutes. I'd say that if anything, that's an enhancement on the film and actually serves a purpose as why it set itself out as not being a film that was seen as good but forgotten, and it's instead a film that's remembered as being great.
Yeah, I completely agree. So before we get on to kind of rating it, should we have a look at some of the acting performances? Will, what did you make of Keanu Reeves as Neo, or maybe some of the other supporting characters?
Yeah, again, so I'm going to say this every single episode. I don't look at actors before I watch films, so I obviously know who Keanu Reeves is. I actually can't pinpoint if I've seen many of his films or not.
Knows who he is, but calls him Keanu.
Keanu. But yeah, so surprised to see him. Was this his first kind of big role in film?
I actually do not know. I can check. I feel like no. So he'd done a film, definitely done a film before with Sandra Bullock called Speed. That's quite a famous film. I'm trying to think. That was 1990s. He'd done some other things, Point Break, stuff like that. So he's an established actor, but I wouldn't say he's A-list of the A-list. You know what I mean? I think there's some other people knocking about as well.
I think before The Matrix, he was kind of like he was still a kind of protagonist in a couple of films, like we said, Speed and Point Blank.
Yeah.
Point Break, sorry. But he was quite kind of like the young, not immature, but like he looked very young. This was the first thing where you saw him and it was like, it's a man.
Yeah. No, I agree. It's kind of like the Macaulay Culkin situation. I feel he was a bit baby-faced at points in this film, but his development, you're right, Rory, like his development was really good. And by the end of the film, he was like fully, you appreciate this guy's hard. Like, don't mess with Neo in this film at the end because he'll batter you. But yeah, no, I thought his performance was good. Like I've said it already.
I think you're 100.
Some of his lines were a bit overacted at points and just a bit like, I can't fully buy into this, but overall, I think he did quite well. And I think he was cast well for the role as well. Particularly at the start, I think his acting at the start of the film was actually almost more impactful on me than towards the end, when he was just kind of playing someone that was not as informed and didn't really know what was going on.
I think one of the big questions with Keanu Reeves and Neo in terms of acting in this film is the balance of emotion. Because I think as the kind of hero, you, especially in this kind of apocalyptic, kind of technological world, you don't know how much emotion he should be showing, especially since he's kind of like born again, whether he's like got the lived experience to feel comfortable in the world. Harry, do you think that mattered that much? Do you think he did it well?
Yeah, to be honest, I think the fact that people look at Keanu Reeves so positively is a sign that he probably did do it well, because this is the film he's most known for, isn't it? It's this or John Wick, which is, I'll be honest, John Wick is shit. I'm sorry. If you don't like it, I don't care. So he does get the balance right, but weirdly, I think where he's playing a human that almost has to pretend to be more robot, that's what makes Hugo Weaving's performance better than his, is that Hugo Weaving is a robot who actually has these semblances of being a human. Keanu Reeves does a good job of, he's emotional when he's in the Matrix, but as he slowly starts to realize his sort of position, you can see he takes the emotional aspect out and he becomes more sort of, when they have essentially the main fight at the end, he's sort of pretty flat, emotionless, and that's where he moves into the state of, I am the one, whatever. Whereas it's the opposite for Hugo Weaving, who starts as the Mr. Anderson glasses, gets in fights, and then you see him acting differently to the other agents, even though they're all essentially carbon copies of one another. And that, to me, is more indicative of the really good performance, because it shows that he's subtly making a difference without being as obtuse as saying, I'm a rebelling sentient mind in a robot form. So as you said, Rory, when you said Lawrence Fishburne and Hugo Weaving, I'd say those two are the ones who actually give the really standout performances of both people who are trying to be as level as possible, but still bring an emotional aspect that isn't just someone speaking everyone else's voice.
One of my favourite scenes in the entire film is when Hugo Weaving is interrogating Lawrence Fishburne in like that high-rise building, and Weaving kind of gives this monologue about why he hates the human race and why he sees it as like a disease. But the amount of personality he puts into like an AI, the amount of personality and like it's basically emotion, right? He puts this kind of hatred, which you don't think a robot is going to feel hatred for anything. It's like does a job, executes it, and it's done. But he feels this like bitterness. And the way he conveys it is just so emotional. And then when you like think about it, you're like, hang on, this isn't a person. This is just like a robot that's chasing the like guys that are messing with the system.
Yeah, I think I just think it does these subtle little things that otherwise you wouldn't notice, but when they all are summed, they amount to something that's significant in the whole course of the film. I literally just remembered this. There's one tiny thing that for some reason stood out to me. In one of the first few scenes, when Neo is still in the Matrix and is trying to escape from the agents who first come and collect him, he goes into his boss's office and he's going to go out on the edge of the skyscraper and crawl around the edge, and he doesn't do it. Every other film on Earth will have him making that jump and he escapes. And the Matrix doesn't do that. It almost knows that is the point, is that it is showing him as being human. He is not yet that self-believing, benevolent, omniscient
it's doubt,
being.
Isn't it? That's part of the story. It's doubt that Neo thinks that he can't do it, which is why he ultimately doesn't escape. That I'm furiously Googling this 7-stage philosophy thing now, because that's one of the first stages of overcoming doubt, and that's how it's reflected in the film. I'm going to continue, but yeah, sorry, I jumped in there, Harry, because I'm trying.
I think one thing that's massively underrated in the film is the amount of suspense. And the scene you just mentioned, Harry, when I first watched the film, I remember being so confused at the fact he gets caught immediately. And like, I swear this guy's the hero. Like, how is he already kind of doesn't have the confidence to escape and like get into the position that you're talking about, the position of like power. But as a plot point, which I imagine Will is reading about right now, I think that movement of doubt and the kind of enabling of the red pill, like seeing the real world for what it is just communicated so well in the film.
I've got to ask, would we take the red pill or the blue pill? What are you saying?
It's great.
I don't know. I think I might take the blue pill, to be honest.
See, I can't remember if it's in the first film, but the people in Zion have a pretty good time. There's a party scene where I think it's the first time Neo and Trinity are properly intimate, but it's like basically an underground rave.
that was something, yeah. Nice.
So yeah, I'd be happy taking the red pill if someone could get me to Zion pretty quickly.
If you could have a night, so you want a night out, that's what you're taking the red pill for.
And I want a night out.
Okay, sweet.
Maybe I could have a night out in the Matrix. I'd just be.
That's what I mean. I feel like it's quite a realistic possibility. All right, Will,
you're on.
You're a textbook blue pillar, aren't you, Will?
I think this is so hard because everyone romantically would say they take the red pill, like they would want to.
They
would want to be the hero. They would want to save the human race, but I don't know.
It's Jeremy asking Mark and Peep Show, would you join the resistance, isn't it? It's like, it's great to say you would, but would you actually? Do you know what I mean?
It is hard. I would hopefully say that I would probably take the red pill.
He's such a blue pillar. Be quiet.
This is hatred. This is a hate crime. I don't accept it.
Okay, well, we can't decide what pill. Yeah,
let's get on to giving our ratings for this film, Harry. Whether it's a category or a number, how do you see this film?
At the end of the day, even if you don't like it, I have to accept that The Matrix is a good film. It might not have aged amazingly, but it's been 20 years. You've got to leave it alone. Technology has moved on. They're no longer using Vista to make these films, so you can't have a go at them. The Avengers looks better. I do sort of agree with Will. Some of the acting is a little bit cheese, but the core concept is solid. Do you know what I mean? it's not a film that is specifically aimed at me, I wouldn't say. However, I reckon had I been, as I say, alive in 1999, I was born in 98. If I'd been, the age I am now in 1999, I probably would love this film and think it's the most legendary thing in the world. So I'm saying it's probably like low to mid 7. Is that all right? Can I say that? I just I like it, but no, sorry, I don't like it that much. But I accept that it is a good film. But I like it more for the sort of techniques than I do for the film itself. And I think that's my own fault for having seen so much that tackles similar stuff since, that it's almost become that trope of I've seen this done before, and yet this was the thing that did it the first time. So I wouldn't go to my rating to be the fairest on that. And it's still worth watching. I just don't think it's the, be all and end all number 16 film of all time, whatever it is on IMDb.
You've been so positive all this time, and then you give it like a...
No, I can be a positive bloke. That's good for me. 5's average. That's above average.
Okay, so moving to you, Will, how would you rate The Matrix?
Why is Harry laughing?
I just think it's funny, mate. I just can't wait to hear what you're going to say.
Okay, that's fine. So I've got to be honest. When I actually came out of this film, I was genuinely in like high 6s, just on initial impressions and impact, and taking it as an action film with very high level views of like acting and script and stuff. But said it throughout the podcast, the more you kind of look into The Matrix and what it is, and Harry's kind of opened my eyes to all of the things that they did with camera angles and visual effects and stuff. And
I do have that effect on people.
How innovative they were in making this film. It quickly starts to kind of like climb up way into the 7s. So for me, I'm probably going to give it see, I've got a number in my head, but I know that it's the number that's been given on a very well-known rating website. So I'm trying to steer away from it.
Hey, you're allowed to give, that is literally the mean average.
I know, but so I'm going to give it an 8.3. I don't think I can give it like, I think that's really being quite generous to it as well. But I am trying to consider not just the film as a one-time watching experience, as more of something that I think is going to grow. But maybe my rating will change. Maybe I'll rescind that in a later episode. But that's what I'm going with for now. Rory, what are your thoughts? I've got a feeling you're relatively high on this film.
Oh, I'm definitely relatively high on this film. I would go with an 8.9. I think this film, for everything it is as a film, especially at the time, was just so innovative, so engaging, such a fun watch. And then everything outside of the film, the kind of transmedia storytelling, in the sense that not just a film, you've got video games, you've got, I think there were like graphic novels that came out with it. People talk about how the script basically reads like a novel in itself. All of that contributes to a universe that I just really vibe with. And the story just like captures your imagination, makes you question so many things that are deeper than just like a guy dodging bullets. And yeah, I love the film.
Great. Rory's vibing with it. That's what we like to hear.
Cool.
Cracker.
So
yes,
that was The Matrix.